Every day, billions of people eat this bird. Fried, roasted, scrambled, packed into cartons. But before it became the world's most ordinary food, it was a wild animal that feared humans. But here is a question: how did this animal become so ordinary? You might assume the answer is simple. Ancient humans found a wild bird, decided it looked tasty, and started raising it for food. Case closed. But the real answer is far stranger. The chicken did not begin as a farm animal. It began as a wild bird approaching a human-made landscape. Somewhere in the forests of Southeast Asia, thousands of years ago, there lived a small, nervous forest-edge bird. Scientists call its kind Red Jungle Fowl. For this story, we will call her Rufa. Rufa is not a real bird that anyone dug up from the ground. She is a stand-in, a way of picturing what Red Jungle Fowl were probably like before everything changed. And what Rufa wanted more than anything was to stay far away from people. Why would a bird want to avoid the very species that would one day fill the entire planet with her descendants? Because humans were dangerous. Loud footsteps, strange smells, fast movement. To a small bird that could fit in two hands, a human was a threat, not a friend. Before chickens ever lived beside people, their ancestors survived by staying away from them. Rufa spent her days low in the underbrush at the edge of the trees where the forest met open ground. She listened for danger, hawks from above, snakes and small predators from below. She was built for caution, not comfort. If a shadow moved wrong, she vanished into the leaves in an instant. So what changed? Not Rufa, not directly anyway. What changed first was the land itself. In parts of mainland Southeast Asia, communities of early farmers began doing something new. They cleared patches of forest. They planted rice. They planted millet. This is called cereal cultivation, which just means growing grain crops on purpose, season after season, instead of only gathering wild plants. Picture one of these early farmers. We will not give him a name because no one knows his real name and no one ever will. Let us just call him the grain keeper. He is not a scientist. He is not trying to invent a new animal. He is only trying to feed his family and his community. The grain keeper plants his fields. He waits. He harvests. He dries the grain in the sun. He carries it in baskets back toward his settlement. Along the way, seeds spill. Grain gets left in open piles to dry. Husks and scraps pile up near the huts. None of this is done for Rufa. It is simply what farming looks like. But farming quietly built something else. It built a new kind of place, not forest, not wilderness, something in between. Researchers call this a human niche. That sounds complicated, but it just means a landscape shaped by people. Fields instead of thick forest, stored grain instead of scattered wild seeds. Food waste, insects drawn to that waste. Safer, more open ground near the edges of settlements. Repeated, predictable human activity, day after day. For a lot of forest animals, a human niche is just a place to avoid, the same as any other danger. But for a bird that already lived at the edges of clearings and eats seeds and insects, something started to shift. What do you think happens when a nervous forest bird discovers an easy meal sitting in the open? At first, nothing. Rufa is cautious. She sees the spilled grain near the settlement, but she does not approach. Not yet. Fear wins. Then slowly something changes. Maybe the people leave for a while. Maybe it is early morning, quiet, no movement. Rufa edges closer. She grabs a few scattered seeds and darts back into cover. Nothing bad happens. She survives. She comes back another day and another. This was not yet a chicken farm. It was the beginning of a relationship. Here is something important to understand. The grain keeper did not go into the forest and chase down wild birds to drag them home. That is not how this story worked, at least not at first. People did not need to hunt jungle fowl into their villages. Farming created a place worth approaching on its own. The birds came because the food was there, not because anyone forced them. Over time, across many years and many generations of birds, not every jungle fowl responded the same way. Some were bolder. Some stayed closer to the fields and huts for longer stretches. Others stayed fearful and kept their distance, sticking to the deep forest the way their ancestors always had. Which kind of bird do you think ended up living a longer, easier life near the human niche? The bolder ones, the ones a little less panicked by human movement, the ones willing to feed near people without vanishing at the first noise. Generation after generation, these bolder birds stuck around the fields, the storage areas, the paths near the settlement. Humans, for their part, mostly tolerated them, sometimes protected them. sometimes moved a bird from one place to another, or exchanged birds with neighboring communities. Domestication did not happen in one afternoon. It unfolded through repeated encounters across many generations. Nobody woke up one morning and declared, "Today I will invent the chicken." It was slower than that, and stranger than that, and much more interesting than that. So how do we actually know any of this happened? This is where the story leaves old bones and stories and enters something more careful, something built out of evidence. This is where the archaeologist comes in, not a single named person, but a way of representing the scientists who dig, measure, and date old animal remains to figure out what really happened. In 2022, a large team of researchers, led by a scientist named Joris Peters, published a major study reassessing chicken bones from archaeological sites all across the world, not just a handful of sites either. Their study reviewed evidence from more than 600 archaeological locations spread across 89 countries. That is an enormous amount of digging, cataloging, and rechecking. And what they were hunting for was something very specific, the earliest bones that could be identified, without doubt, as belonging to a domestic chicken, not a wild junglefowl and not some other bird entirely. Why does that distinction even matter? Because a chicken bone found in old dirt does not automatically prove domestication. Bones can be misidentified, dates can be wrong, wild and early domestic birds can look nearly identical in the ground. Good science means being careful, not certain, about claims like this. According to that 2022 study, the earliest unambiguous domestic chicken remains identified in the entire dataset came from a site called Ban Non Wat in central Thailand, dated to somewhere between 1650 and 1250 BCE. That does not mean every chicken on Earth began at that one exact village or on one specific day. It means this is where, based on current evidence, the picture becomes especially clear. Archaeological evidence changes as bones are redated, re-identified, and reinterpreted. This 2022 study is an influential reconstruction based on current evidence, not a final, unchangeable answer carved in stone. What did the researchers notice happening around that same time and place? A correlation, meaning a pattern that shows up together, between early domestic chicken evidence and the arrival of rice and millet farming in regions where red junglefowl naturally lived. The researchers proposed that grain cultivation and storage may have acted like a magnet, drawing wild junglefowl closer and closer into the human niche. The evidence currently supports the idea that farming reshaped the landscape first, and the birds responded to that new landscape, not the other way around. Here is a twist you probably were not expecting. You might assume that once chickens were living near people, the very next step was obvious. Humans started eating them constantly, for meat and eggs, exactly the way we do today. But the first chickens may not have become important because they were dinner. Early evidence suggests something more surprising. Unusual, brightly patterned, or striking birds may have been noticed, exchanged between communities, carried along early trade routes, and sometimes handled in ways connected to symbolism or status, long before chickens became an everyday food source on a massive scale. Before the chicken became ordinary food, it may have been unusual enough to be noticed, moved, admired, and valued for reasons that had little to do with a dinner plate. Isn't it strange to think that the animal now eaten more than almost any other on the planet may have started out as something closer to a curiosity? From there, the spread continued, slowly and then not so slowly. From mainland Southeast Asia, domestic chickens moved outward, carried by traders, travelers, and settlers into wider parts of Asia, and eventually toward the Mediterranean and Europe. Over centuries, they became woven into farms, households, religious practices, and eventually industrial food systems across the entire globe. The chicken did not conquer the world because it was always dinner. It first became part of human lives, and only later became part of human diets on a massive scale. Now think back to that plate, the egg carton, the chicken soup, the backyard hen pecking at the ground in someone's yard. None of that ordinary, everyday scene tells you the real story sitting underneath it. A wild, cautious forest bird, a landscape reshaped by early farmers growing rice and millet, scattered grain that nobody planned as an invitation, but became one anyway. Generations of birds slowly trading fear for familiarity, and centuries later, careful scientists digging through 600 sites in 89 countries just to pin down where the clearest evidence of that transformation first appears. The chicken beside a farm, inside a coop, or on a dinner plate still carries the history of a wild bird that once stepped out of the forest for spilled grain.